My name is Monica Sasso. I work at Red Hat. I'm on the Global Financial Services team based here in London. My official title is Global Financial Services Digital Transformation Lead. Say that 5 times backwards. I look after operational resilience for us, as well as our asset and wealth management business. I joined Red Hat 5 years ago from Deutsche Bank Wealth Management, where I was the global head of regulatory and risk change. Exciting stuff for anybody here who works in a bank. I delivered MiFID II for Deutsche, and afterwards I promptly found a barrel of wine and drowned my sorrows in it. And I can still talk about that. Anyway, I'm going to talk a little bit about operational resilience today and how to balance operational resilience and innovation. Very happy to have detailed conversations after the fact. I'm also very happy to be interrupted. There's nothing more I hate than feeling like I'm talking to myself, especially in a small, intimate group here. I would much rather be interrupted, asked questions, because we're going to be talking about operational resilience. What does that mean today? We're going to not talk about politics, Robert, although I suspect we all might agree on lots of things. A little bit about what it means in a modern technology context, and I will talk about risk. I will talk about, this is where I can draw on some of my experience having worked in the banks doing this kind of stuff. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about the limits of technology resilience, share some use cases in where we've helped customers really find that balance between consistency and flexibility so that they can innovate and still be resilient. And then also what resilience, like I said, what resilience really means. And again, please interrupt me. I don't want to, again, feel like I'm talking to myself. Some of these topics are a little bit meaty, and they mean lots of different things to different people. And when you look at things like DORA or UK op-res rules, because we are in the UK, but we're going to say DORA because DORA is easier to say, what it is, why it matters, and what does it really mean in the context of your platform and the hybrid cloud and modern technology. So that's the first section. So I think you'd have to be under a rock to not realize that cloud usage is being reshaped by regulatory requirements. Some of them we've already had, and we know about GDPR. Some of them we aren't yet legislated for, like cloud sovereignty, but there's lots of stuff going on, and it's not just in Europe. You've got these other regimes in Canada, in Singapore, obviously in the UK, some bits and bobs in the US, and then in Hong Kong as well. Huge stuff going on in Australia and New Zealand. So it's not just us here in Europe. I'm not saying the EU, in Europe. It is all around the world, and I think it's only becoming more intense as we progress through 2025. So really, what does all of this mean? Because I don't know if anybody's read DORA. I mean, if you ever need to go to sleep, just read it. Like all EU laws, they're really good at solving all of your insomnia problems. It's essentially about understanding your minimum viable bank, identifying it, and what services you need to keep up and running all of the time so that you can service your customers, so that you can service us. Right? So what do you need to keep up and running? So I call it your minimum viable bank. It could be your minimum viable grocery store. We were talking earlier with my colleague, he's in the front, truth be told, about when Sainsbury's couldn't take digital payments for a day. They didn't know what their minimum viable grocery store was. Turns out it's their payment system. So what does good look like? I always come at these things from different lenses because, like I said, I used to be the head of Reagan Risk Change. Not a terribly sexy role, but I enjoyed it because for me, it was about solving problems. It was about shaping the next generation of operating model for the bank to service our clients. So the first thing is, I'm standing right in front of my own slides. What does the banking supervisor care about? Ultimately, they care about preserving financial stability and preventing customer harm. We're the customers here. So what does the bank care about? What does the firm care about? They want to make sure that they can keep their minimum viable bank up and running, hopefully, and that they can deliver uninterrupted business services. And then lastly, what do we think, right? So we as Red Hat, we are a third party. Hopefully we are your critical third party providers. That's our goal. But we are a third party technology provider. So what do we care about in terms of operational resilience? And I do think it's important to understand all these lenses so that you can understand what I care about when we have a conversation with you and vice versa. And what we care about is making sure that we deliver against our contractual requirements, ultimately. And it's not just us, right? It's also about cloud providers. It's about your SaaS providers or any other software provider that you might engage with, or hardware provider for that matter, that you might engage with. So this is kind of everybody's lenses and really what they care about from a resilience point of view. But the reality of it is that all of these rules are all about planning for failure. If you think about past laws and past regulations, everything was about how do you mitigate the risk of a failure. Well, I'm going to say this now because it's a small, intimate audience. Tough shit, everything's going to fail. So you can't prevent the risk of failure. It's going to happen. So you have to now plan for it and create an environment where you can succeed amongst failure. So it's about, plan for it, test for it together, and this is where our opinion is we need to do this much more with our customers, is plan for failure together, because essentially we're going to have to mitigate for the five F's, and we were talking about this earlier. Fires, floods, failures, and fat fingers. There's 2 F's in fat fingers. There's not another one that we were going through and saying earlier. Okay, so that's kind of the background. There's lots of areas of DORA. Lots of tech companies like us have had opinions about it. But the reality of it is there's only 5 areas where Red Hat can have an opinion because we are a tech provider, because we, from an automation and a platform point of view, there's really only 5 areas that we can have an opinion about. One is around helping our customers with exit strategies, so stressed exit, unstressed exits, disaster recovery, things like that. The second area really is around how can we help you define a future-proof platform? How can we help you create a vendor lock-in or vendor-proof, if you will, platform? The third one really is around how automation can enable resilience. Again, this is our bread and butter. This is something that we're very passionate about. So how can we help you use automation, for example, to connect all of your islands of automation, connect silos, all of those sorts of things, and ultimately get to the utopia of infrastructure as code. The fourth area that we know we can have an opinion about and support with is around how we manage non-functional requirements as a software provider, and also essentially our own third-party risk. And then that last area really is these kind of 2 over here. It's the security bit and the penetration testing. And even though I wasn't going to do this, I'm going to, because again, it's a small audience. My colleague Chris up here, he's our security guy. He knows all this stuff. Every time I talk to him, I feel like either that I need to go learn more or I learned something. It's one of those 2 things, probably both. So those are areas where we know we can support and we have a role to play from an operational resilience point of view. Right, so what does all of this mean in a modern technology context? And for those of you with eagle eyes, you'll note down here, this is a definition of modern technology stolen from ChatGPT. I can barely read it, but it's because I'm old. It's modern technology, right? It's Kubernetes, it's CI/CD, it's all these fancy words that we all know. It's not like waterfall, right? That's what modern technology it's all about. So what does DORA and operational resilience mean in a modern technology context? It means that there's new risks to consider. And this is where it's going to get boring. So if anybody has any questions or wants to explain something, I'm very happy to do so. It means that we have to think about new ways of working to mitigate third-party risk. And it means that we need to plan for failure. And before I get into some of the boring stuff, I will say the reason I left Deutsche was because I was really frustrated when I was ahead of change. I would say to my IT colleagues, I would say, hey, listen, where are we with A, B, and C? And I would get a color back. And I was like, no, mate, you got to give me more than a color, red, amber, green. I wanted the details. There was still just this wall between IT and the business. And I was like half, right, because I was changed. So I was sort of business, sort of IT, sort of control functions. So I was like nobody. And I kept getting colors. I'm like, mate, you got to tell me what's going to be delivered and what's not going to be delivered so that I can go and plan for that or change operating models or whatever. And he kept saying, no, you don't have to know, you're the business. So I went to the COO afterwards and I said, hey, I'd like to go do some time in IT because I feel like as technology evolves, it's going to glue us together as an organization and it's going to matter more and we need to be more joined up. He says to me, it's going to take you off the MD path. You really shouldn't do that. So I said, thanks, but no thanks. And I came over to Red Hat so I could learn about tech because I am so passionate that we have to be speaking each other's languages. And the more that tech has glued us together, the more it matters to make sure that we can deliver a resilient service for the market, essentially. Right, so all that means is that there is a different way to think about risk, right? When I talk to my friends and the regulators, and I do know people in the regulators, it's a very boring life I lead, which is probably why I drink so much. They're terrified about certain things. And I think we've all seen these things play out whenever there's a cloud outage or a different outage like that. They're terrified where the colors change at the handover points. So these are new risks to consider, right? All of a sudden, we've gone from this perimeter way of thinking about risk and your data and your technology. It's in your own data center. It's within your four walls. You can protect it. You own the whole triangle. When you start outsourcing to different third parties, what you own is different. And then you have these handover points between the hardware provider and the software infrastructure, which is us, or then between the software infrastructure and the application, which is your application, presumably, or a third party's application. That's what terrifies the regulators, because it's at that handover point is where the blame game happens. When there's a hardware failure, and then our operating system fails, who do you blame? Well, it's not about blame. You should just be getting it back up and running. But the reality of it is there's a blame game going on. And that's what terrifies the regulators. When the proverbial hits the fan, who's going to make sure it just gets fixed? And that's what's behind all of these rules. So actually now this is the way we should be thinking about risk, is how do we manage these handover points? How do we manage those interdependencies? And each of these, now there's a lot on the slide. I'm going to probably not go through all of it. And if anybody wants to talk to me afterwards, I can put you to sleep about it. But the whole point of all of this is to get us to think differently about risk and technology and how we implement it in our firms so that we can keep our minimum viable bank up and running, right? So for example, the further you go up to more from black to blue, your reliance on third and fourth and fifth parties, not just third parties, your fourth and fifth parties increases. And we all know you have no control of your fourth and fifth parties. Maybe in DORA you have a tiny bit of control, but that falls into the bucket of you don't know what you don't know because you're paying for the privilege of not knowing. But that increases your risk profile, right? That also increases your, or decreases your ability to have application portability or vendor choice as you go up. As you go down, or sorry, as you go up, you also can capitalize on different benefits that all the different technology providers offer. But you do that as a trade-off. So the whole point of this was to think about all of the different trade-offs and how they work in your firm's risk appetite so that you can continue to deliver your minimum viable bank under the 5 Fs: fires, floods, failure, fat fingers. And there, Chris, I'm gonna say that and I'm gonna get myself in some serious hot water. But ultimately, right, I think the most important thing that I'm going to say about this, which then is, Robert, you asked me about my opinion. This is our opinion, right? So as you increase your dependencies on third-party providers, the need for enterprise automation, standardization, interoperability, and consistency increases so that you can deliver a high availability architecture so that you can have DR as part of your DNA, disaster recovery as part of your DNA, and that you have the ability to exit. So there's a lot on there. Like I said, I'm sure it's going to put all of you to sleep, but very happy to have a conversation afterwards. Yeah, please do. Ask away.
So the company, well, there's hyperscalers and then there's companies like Red Hat.
Yep.
So in a DORA world where you shouldn't be reliant, you need an exit strategy.
Yep.
If I was to say, right, I can deploy my application. I'm cloud agnostic, so I can run it in Google, AWS. So I can make it diverse. But at the moment, I'm reliant on OpenShift.
Yeah.
So if Red Hat went out of business,
yep.
OpenShift disappeared.
Yep, I've got lots. I can answer that question. I can give you a whole paper that tells you how you can do it. But ultimately, because we are all about open source software, and we're here today at the OSSF. Good Lord. That's the answer, right? So with open source, you have the code. We don't sell you licenses, we sell you a subscription. So you've got the code, you're not tied in contractually, you have the code. All you have to do as a firm, and I've said this to regulators, is make sure you've got the people and the processes lined up to manage that software. So to make sure that you've got people that are constantly scanning I don't know, the open source community or the dark web. You know this better than I do. I don't. I'm going to make this crap up now. For vulnerabilities and issues, and that you have the inbuilt processes to update your Kubernetes platforms, your automation platform, and your operating system. So I can give you more detail later, but I feel like that might take me down a path. But actually, that's also open source. That's the beauty of open source software. You have the code, right? You know all the vulnerabilities that are in it. We publish them. as they happen. That would be something you would have to do as a firm. So, and because again, it's open source, you're not locked into anything. Right. So what all this means, and this is kind of based on an example that we worked through, which I'll try to hurry up and get to at the end. What all this means, right, is how we work together has to change. DORA is like a Rubik's Cube. Has anybody here ever solved a Rubik's Cube? Yeah, exactly. I have a nephew who's a speed cuber. Yeah, yeah, exactly. He's a speed cuber. He sent me this video, and I think I fell asleep. But what it means, though, is how you work together. You know, like I said, DORA is a Rubik's Cube. So how you do it and how you work with people like us has to change and has to evolve. Because you have to plan and practice for failure. If you only focus on one thing, with this customer in particular where I was given this talk through, they were, one weekend, it was in the middle of all of this stuff where we were helping them plan for a big migration to the public cloud. They're a systemically important European firm, and their CEO said, hey, you have to move to the public cloud. And they were like, oh my God, we have to move. We have no more data centers. The regulators, more than one, are saying, you can't do this, you can't do that. So we had to help them find a way. We'll get to that at the end. And in the middle of all this, over one of the weekends, they did a DR test. And they didn't include us. And guess what? Failed. Some of the software infrastructure. And I said, guys, the more connected you are, the more you rely on us, you got to include us on your tests so that when you have a failure, you can fix it straight away. Because if not, when you focus on one bit, you scupper everything else when you only partially get one bit good. But if you have a plan and you execute it together, yeah, see, these are actually the steps. I have no clue. Hand on heart, I did have to do screenshots because I was like, I'm not doing this on my own. So that when it does happen, we can all succeed together, right? Because then we don't have the reputational damage, and internally you don't have, why aren't you guys managing your third-party provider properly? Go fire them. Well, that's not really the problem. Right, okay, so now on to the limits of technology resilience. So there's three kind of sections in this. We're gonna talk a little bit about architecting for resilience, talk about a future-proof platform and the principles of it, and then talk about the 7 limits of portability, application portability, and choice, which kind of talks a little bit about your open source bit. So I've been challenged by many customers, and they've said, well, how can the open hybrid cloud really be resilient? How can we avoid vendor lock-in? Well, it's got to be architected, managed, and used resiliently. I'm not going to go through each of these 10 principles, but I've seen some of these. Well, we've seen some of these at Red Hat. Actually, we've seen all of these 10 things. We've seen them all happen and cause problems, which is why up here really is lessons learned from implementing the open hybrid cloud in a resilient manner. A couple of the things on here that I'm going to pick up on is design for resilience, right? You've got to design for business continuity. You can't just design for features. Also, you've got to look at all the dependencies. I mean, that's the toughest thing. It's where I was working with a customer, and they said, listen, all we're going to do, Monica, is plan for application portability. And I said, okay, so this is your trading system. It was a trading system. I said, what about your data? What about your networks? Yeah, but that's not my scope. Well, that's great. You can have application portability like that if you're running on OpenShift and you have it orchestrated with automation. But what about the data? What about your network? What about your storage? Well, all I care about is the platform because that's what I own. I said, well, then don't bother bringing our consultants in because you're going to fail the minute that you try, because he didn't care about the dependencies, even though he needed them for his platform. I think the other two I'll spend a little bit of time on is know the limits of resilience, which I'll kind of share those next. But I think it's important to know them from the very beginning. One of my mentors is a chief risk officer at a large bank here in the UK, and we were having a catch-up, a couple martinis in, and she says to me, you'd be so proud of me, Monica. What's that? I approved the cloud. I said, what do you mean you approved the cloud? I said, I'm going to need another drink for this. And she said, I approved the cloud. I said, well, what did you approve? Please tell me. And this is somebody who can barely use her mobile phone, so she doesn't know what a container is and that's fine, that's okay, everybody has their role to play. And she said, well, I approved Amazon. And I said, okay, well, what did you approve? The cloud. So I had explained to her what all of that meant, and I said, here are 10 questions, go back to your CTO. And the next time you see your CTO, stick your 4-inch stilettos up his backside, because you shouldn't have approved what you approved for what you approved it for. because nobody bothered to tell her the limits of resilience or to tell her what they were going to use it for. That, I think, it was a real lesson for me, is you've got to have these better conversations. And then the last one is, I think it's worth talking about, is the end-to-end supply chain visibility. We've all seen these with CrowdStrike, with Fastly, all these big major outages that have been all over the BBC, is you've got to know who your fourth and your fifth parties are. Because they're the ones, when they go down, those are the fat finger stuff, right? When they go down and you have no idea why. Part of using third-party providers is you want to remove the risk of having to do that stuff yourself. But in doing so, you create a new risk. And that's the fourth and fifth party risk. So you want to understand who is in your delivery supply chain, your software supply chain, and your actual supply chain. Right, so this is then, Robert, you asked about our opinion. This is our opinion. You know, if you want to have a future-proof platform that is resilient, that allows you to innovate, that allows you to capitalize on AI technology, that allows you to even think about quantum, because that's coming. I'm sure all of you here have colleagues that work in quantum that you may or may not be aware of. You know, you need to abstract away all that complexity in your organization, all that complexity in your tech stack. You need to have a single platform to innovate from. You need to have security at the very beginning, at the very end, through every single stage in the life cycle. You need to be able to have a platform that can operate over any hardware using any silicon architecture, so that you can be ready for generative AI, because all of you all use AI today. But for generative AI and for quantum, these things are coming, and they're coming fast. And what you don't want to have is, I've been working with a CTO at a bank here, and he's like, Monica, I've got like 5 or 6 different kinds of architectures I can't manage. Because he's got one for Google, he's got one for Amazon, he's got one for Microsoft, he's got one for on-prem, and he's thinking about one for AI. And I'm like, mate, you're killing yourself. You need to abstract away the complexity. You need to make it easy so that you can manage where you run your workloads at what time of day, for example, so that you can make sure you're also secure, right? So that you reduce your attack vectors. And that's where you kind of have to balance consistency and flexibility in order to have that resilience and the ability to innovate. So the last one is this, as I promised, almost on time actually, even though we started late, a little bit of an example where I've kind of been talking vaguely about with this customer that we've been working with in Europe. Kind of walked through a little bit of the journey. They came to us and they said, listen, we have to move to the public cloud, but we have to comply. And because I've been on the other side of the fence having that business versus IT conversation intimately, I was chatting with one of the guys and he said, well, listen, we need to understand value. And I said, let me guess. You need to define some KPIs so that you can go to your lines of business, because they have the purse strings. You want to be able to showcase the value of modernizing, the value of the public cloud, and the value of creating this abstraction layer. And he said, exactly. And I said, you probably also have to keep a couple risk people happy and maybe some ESG people. And he said, yes, how did you know? And I said, because I used to be the other side of that. So we paired together and we created some business-led KPIs all around modernizing so that they could then use that to justify, even though they had no choice, but to justify capitalizing on the benefits of the public cloud, build a high availability architecture. We also help them create a strategy for disaster recovery, so stressed exit and unstressed exit in the DORA language, and also the UK OpRes language. We help them use all of this stuff to create plans and architectures for this failover. We also created a demo with them to show how you could have application portability, which again, of course, fails if you don't have data portability or network or storage portability, but that's something else we're working on the next phase. Actually, this is a third thing we need to work on, Chris. The other thing that we did, and this is where it's quite interesting, is we helped them define a workload distribution strategy that works in a highly regulated industry. There's lots of big words in there, but it's essentially not putting all your eggs in one basket. So not having all of your most important application only running in one instance, in one cluster, in one place. So it's about how you spread it out. So when there's a problem, you minimize the blast radius. That's part of that, is about having a resilient strategy, a resilient workload distribution strategy. The other thing we spent a lot of time with them on was new ways of working, that Rubik's Cube. You know, we spent like a couple hours just talking about the Rubik's Cube, because I said, guys, you've got to bring us in, especially when you start talking about different threat-led penetration testing. If you don't bring your third-party providers in, forget about it. And then the last thing that we did was we also worked with them on completing an end-to-end automation assessment. And we see this all the time with our clients pretty much around the world in every industry, is everybody has amazing automation in pockets and silos. And when you start to use public cloud providers, for example, or modern technology, if you don't tie together those islands of automation, you won't get that portability. You won't get that future-proof platform to innovate from. You'll have an amazing bit of automation here that doesn't talk to anything else. So it's about having, across the entire IT estate, having that view. So we did that with them, and out the back of that assessment came essentially a to-do list. And then the last thing we did was we completed cluster health checks and also reviewed all of their migration approaches. So as a last slide to leave up here is, and again, this is in our experience at Red Hat, what we've seen fail and succeed with clients around the world is the limits of technology resilience or application portability. I wanted to put 7 deadly sins up there, but I was told that that would not be in keeping with the open source way. So it's the 7 limits of resilience. I'll leave this up if anybody has any questions or comments or smart remarks. I think I have 1 minute. Yes, please.
I got asked this question the other day by a non-European customer.
Okay.
And we were talking about resilience, operational resilience, and the need to do it. And they said, so say I don't want to do it. I don't want to have an insurance policy. Who's going to find me? What are they going to find me? Why is that?
What jurisdiction are they in? Are they servicing an EU resident, an EU company?
They're not. No, this is in Indonesia.
Okay, fine.
So it's a long way. But we say, we're DORA compliant. We deliver DORA compliance.
Yeah.
Architectures, and it was a really interesting question because it's regulated.
Yep.
So what's the fine if you don't do it?
So what the fine is, and actually it's funny because I was asked last minute to give a similar talk about operational resilience and DORA to a different industry other than banking, and I was like, oh shit, how do I make this work? It's quite simple, right? If you peel back what it is, let's go back to the very beginning. It's that. There's money associated with failure.
Absolutely.
All DORA does is put it in black and white. So at the core, do you want to keep your business up and running so that you can take money off of me at all times, 24/7, 365, yes or no? That's it. And if you do it in the most clever way, you can then capitalize on newer technologies as they emerge to take more money off of me, 24/7, 365. So forget about the fine piece. It just makes good bloody business sense.
Totally. I mean, that was the approach I took in the answer. It's like, if you don't do it, your customers will walk away.
Exactly. Because somebody else will have done it already.
Yeah.
There's always somebody. I was saying a story earlier. I don't know when it was at Sainsbury's and Greg's when they had their outages and nobody could take electronic payments. My local pet store, I live in Clapham Common, they only took electronic payments, and I went in there to buy some cat food. And I said, well, small shop, right? And I said, well, can I give you cash? I need cat food. I'd rather support a small local business than a big grocery store chain. And she said, no, sorry, we're not allowed to. Do you know what? I haven't been back. But why couldn't that have been her plan B? Why couldn't plan B be take cash? They didn't have it. They didn't know what their minimum viable pet shop was, and they lost a customer.
Your cat's still okay?
Yeah. No, they're fine. Yeah. I mean, all else fails, tin of tuna. Although one of my cats does not like tuna. They're picky little sods. She'll eat a mouse, but not tuna. I don't understand that. Right, any other questions? I'm here all day. You can hire me out for parties and funerals. Super. Thank you all for pretending like you're being engaged. I appreciate that.